Welcome back to Case Closed. I'm James Braden.
And I'm Sheraton Melick.
Always a pleasure to have you here, Sheraton.
Glad to be back with you, James.
So today, we're diving headfirst into a case
Oh, yeah.
that's sending shockwaves, really, through Kenya and beyond.
I'd say so.
And it's a case that pits an entire generation against their leader,
That's right.
Gen Z versus President Samoei Ruto.
You said it.
What a matchup.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head, James, when you said shockwaves.
Well,
This isn't just some legal squabble.
right.
This has the potential to reshape Kenyan politics.
Wow.
And it really speaks to a much larger global trend that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Young people around the world are leveraging digital platforms
Yeah, they are.
to challenge the status quo and hold those in power accountable.
It's like David versus Goliath,
It is.
but with smartphones and hashtags.
Exactly.
And you know we love
With you.
a good David versus Goliath story here on Case Closed.
Absolutely.
So, okay, let's break this down for our listener. Where do we even begin with this case?
Well, the story really starts with President Ruto's election back in 2022.
Okay.
He came to power promising economic prosperity
Right.
and a departure from the old ways of doing things.
Right.
But almost immediately, young Kenyans, particularly Gen Z, started voicing their dissent.
Interesting.
They were grappling with a skyrocketing cost of living,
Mhm.
lack of job opportunities,
Ugh.
and what they perceived as rampant government corruption.
You know, these are issues that resonate with young people globally, right?
Absolutely.
You know, who hasn't felt the pinch of the economy or questioned, their government's acts?
Of course, of course.
Yeah.
But what makes the situation in Kenya so unique is how quickly these frustrations escalated,
Oh, wow.
and how effectively Gen Z utilized digital tools to organize and amplify their message.
Okay.
The hashtag Ruto must go became their rallying cry,
Interesting.
a symbol of their disillusionment with the new administration and their demands for change.
It's a stark contrast. You have a president promising a new era. Yes. And then you have an entire generation online essentially saying, nope, not buying it.
We're not having it.
Yeah. So how did this online discontent translate into real-world action?
Well, things came to a head in June 2024 when protests erupted across Kenya.
Wow.
Remember, this wasn't just about online grumbling.
Right.
This was a volatile mix of political dissatisfaction,
Right.
economic hardship, and allegations of police brutality spilling onto the streets.
It sounds like a powder keg waiting to explode.
It really was.
And then came the abductions, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
As these protests gained momentum, reports started emerging of young people being abducted,
Really?
vanishing without a trace.
Oh, wow.
Some have been released, but many remain missing to this day.
That's terrible.
It sent a chilling message, not just to the protesters,
Right.
but to anyone who dared to criticize the government.
It's a dark turn in the story
It is.
and a clear escalation of tactics.
Yes.
So we've got a frustrated generation taking to the streets,
Yeah.
facing off against a government that seems increasingly willing to silence dissent.
It seems that way.
Where does that leave the opposition parties in all of this?
Yeah.
Surely they must be playing a role.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The opposition, led by veteran politician Raila Odinga,
Okay.
and for our listener who may not be familiar with Kenyan politics,
Right.
Odinga has been a prominent figure in the opposition for decades.
Oh, wow.
He is attempting to hold President Ruto's administration accountable,
Good for him.
but they're facing an uphill battle.
What kind of obstacles are they up against?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is the perception that the judiciary,
Yeah.
which should be a neutral arbiter in the situation,
Right.
lacks independence.
Okay.
This concern is heightened, especially considering the lack of progress in investigating the abductions.
So it's like the very system that's supposed to protect the rights of citizens is, in some ways, failing them.
That's the argument that many in the opposition are making.
Yeah, and to complicate things further, there are divisions within Ruto's own administration.
Oh, absolutely.
You have figures like Cabinet Secretary Kipchumba Murkomen and Oscar Sudi,
Right.
staunch Ruto allies,
Yes.
who have been dismissive of the concerns raised by young people.
Very much so.
I mean, that's adding fuel to the fire, isn't it?
It is.
Dismissing the concerns of an entire generation is hardly a recipe for stability.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
But then you have someone like Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua.
Okay.
He's a bit of a wild card.
Oh, really?
While he's part of Ruto's inner circle,
Right.
he's also expressed sympathy for some of the economic challenges facing young Kenyans.
So there's some internal tension within the government itself.
Yes, and that makes the situation even more unpredictable.
Wow.
Gachagua's stance could be a genuine attempt to bridge the gap,
Right.
or a calculated move to appease a segment of the population.
I see, yeah.
Only time will tell.
It sounds like there are a lot of moving parts here, with
Sure.
everyone maneuvering for position. It's almost Shakespearean, this clash of ideologies, generations, and personalities.
It really is.
And then you throw in the shadowy figure of Farouk Kibet, who adds a whole other layer of intrigue.
Yes, Farouk Kibet,
This guy.
a close confidant of President Ruto.
Right.
And his influence is widely whispered about,
Right.
but his exact role remains a mystery.
He's like the power behind the throne operating in the shadows.
Exactly.
It's enough to make anyone wonder what's really going on behind closed doors.
It really is.
Yeah.
Kibet's influence has been linked to everything from shaping Ruto's political strategies to potentially orchestrating the silencing of dissent.
That's scary.
His involvement adds an element of uncertainty,
Yeah.
making it even harder to predict the government's next move.
It's a real-life political thriller unfolding before our eyes.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we got a president facing accusations,
Yeah.
a generation rising up,
Yeah.
and these powerful figures like Kibet lurking in the shadows.
It is quite a story.
It's like something out of House of Cards,
It is.
but with much higher stakes.
Absolutely.
But let's rewind a bit.
Okay.
Before the protests
Yeah.
and the abductions,
Right.
we talked about Gen Z using social media as a weapon.
Yes.
Can you break down those tactics for our listener?
Well, they've been incredibly savvy.
I bet.
I mean, we're talking about a generation that's grown up with social media.
Right.
They understand its power.
Yeah.
They've been using platforms like X, formerly known as Twitter,
Mhm.
TikTok, and YouTube
Yeah.
to share information, organize protests, and expose what they see as corruption within the government.
You mentioned symbolism earlier.
Oh, yeah.
What did you mean by that?
So they've been using President Ruto's silhouette
Right.
in their online protests.
Interesting.
It's a simple but powerful image.
Okay.
It represents the regime they're fighting against.
Right.
It's incredibly effective in getting their message across, especially to a global audience.
Especially with today's, short attention spans and everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It has to be visual.
Right.
It has to be impactful.
It's interesting how they've taken this very serious issue
Yeah.
and found ways to communicate it in a
Yes.
way that's engaging,
Right.
even artistic.
Yeah, it speaks to their understanding of how information is consumed today.
Yeah.
It has to be concise,
Right.
visually appealing,
Yeah.
easily shareable,
Hmm.
and they're doing it all with a sense of humor and irony,
Oh, really?
which helps to disarm critics
Okay.
and attract a wider audience.
It's like they've turned the tables.
They have.
The government might control traditional media outlets,
Right.
but Gen Z has found a way to bypass those gatekeepers
Yes.
and build their own platforms for dissent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're not waiting for permission to be heard.
Right.
They're creating their own spaces
Good for them.
and setting their own agenda.
Yeah, it's a fundamental shift in how power operates in the digital age.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating to see how
Yeah.
that dynamic is changing.
Okay, so Gen Z is using social media to amplify their message.
Yeah.
But what about those who aren't online?
Right.
What about the rural communities that might not have the same access to technology
Yes.
or exposure to these dissenting voices?
That's a crucial point, James.
Yeah,
Kenya is a diverse country,
it is.
and the digital divide is a real issue.
Right.
While Gen Z in urban areas is leading the charge online,
Mhm.
there are many, particularly in rural communities,
Right.
who still rely on traditional media
Okay.
and who might be more receptive to the government's narrative.
So you have this stark contrast,
Yeah.
a digitally connected,
Right.
globally aware generation clashing with a government
Yeah.
that's perhaps struggling to adapt to this new reality.
Absolutely.
It's a recipe for tension, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And this tension is playing out in the legal arena as well.
Okay.
We mentioned earlier that the opposition is facing an uphill battle. But what are the specific challenges they're encountering within the judicial system?
Yeah, it's one thing to say the judiciary lacks independence.
Yeah.
But what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, for one, there's a history in Kenya of the executive branch exerting influence over the judiciary.
Oh.
This can manifest in various ways,
Okay.
from appointing judges with political ties
Oh, wow.
to delaying or obstructing investigations that might be detrimental to the government.
So even if the opposition has a strong legal case,
Yeah,
there's no guarantee of a fair hearing.
that's the concern.
I see.
And this lack of judicial independence has serious implications.
Right.
Not just for this specific case,
Of course.
but for the rule of law in Kenya more broadly.
Right. Yeah.
If citizens don't believe that the legal system will protect their rights,
Right.
it erodes trust in democratic institutions
Totally.
and creates a climate of fear and impunity.
It's a slippery slope. If people feel like the system is rigged against them, they might be less likely to engage in peaceful protest
Right.
or seek justice through legal channels.
Exactly.
And that's what makes the abductions so alarming.
They do.
They represent a blatant disregard for the rule of law
Right.
and a dangerous escalation of tactics by the government.
Absolutely.
And what about the evidence?
Yeah,
You know, we talk a lot about allegations and accusations,
we do.
but what concrete evidence is there to support these claims of corruption,
Right.
human rights abuses, and government overreach?
Well, let's start with President Ruto's ranking as the second most corrupt president globally.
Oh, wow.
This ranking, compiled by Transparency International,
Yeah.
is based on a number of factors,
Okay.
including perceptions of bribery, abuse of public funds,
Yeah.
and lack of government transparency.
That's a pretty damning statistic.
It is.
Yeah.
And it lends credence to the claims being made by Gen Z.
Right.
It suggests that their concerns about corruption within the government aren't unfounded.
And what about the protests?
Yeah.
Are there any reliable figures on the scale of those demonstrations?
Well, estimates vary,
Okay.
but reputable news sources like The Standard and The Nation,
Okay.
two of Kenya's leading newspapers,
Right.
place the number of participants in the June 2024 protests at over 150,000.
That's a lot of people.
It is.
Wow.
This indicates a significant level of public discontent,
Yeah.
particularly among young people.
Those are huge numbers.
They are.
But what about the abductions?
Right.
Are there any official figures on how many people have disappeared?
Human rights groups such as Amnesty International
Okay.
and Human Rights Watch
Right.
have been meticulously documenting these cases.
Mm-hmm.
Their reports indicate that at least 120 young people have vanished
Wow.
since the June protests.
That's horrifying.
It is.
And what's being done to investigate these disappearances and bring those responsible to justice?
That's where things get murky.
Right.
The government has denied any involvement in the abductions,
Oh, really?
blaming them on criminal gangs,
Oh, gosh.
or even suggesting that some of the disappearances were staged
What?
to discredit the administration.
So they're essentially denying any wrongdoing and shifting the blame.
Yes.
Wow.
And this lack of accountability is fueling further outrage and mistrust.
Right.
Human rights groups and the opposition are calling for independent investigations.
Good.
But so far, there's been little progress.
It's a classic case of he said, she said.
It is.
But the lack of transparency from the government is definitely raising red flags.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to the issue of judicial independence.
Right.
If the judiciary is perceived as being under the influence of the executive branch,
Right.
it's unlikely that those responsible for the abductions will be held accountable.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is.
Corruption erodes trust in institutions,
Yeah.
which in turn makes it harder to combat corruption.
Right.
And the ones who suffer the most are often those who are already marginalized and vulnerable. In this case, it's the young people who are demanding a better future.
Absolutely. It's a sobering thought, James.
It is.
And it speaks to the larger issue of power dynamics in a globalized world.
Yeah.
We're seeing these tensions play out not just in Kenya,
Right.
but in countries around the world.
It's a clash between those who hold power
Yes,
and those who are demanding a seat at the table,
exact.
a voice in the decisions that affect their lives.
Right.
And in many cases, it's technology, particularly social media,
Yes,
that's leveling the playing field.
you're right.
Yeah.
Social media has given a voice to those who have traditionally been silenced or ignored.
It has.
It's allowed them to connect, organize, and challenge those in power in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago.
It's almost like a global awakening, wouldn't you say?
In many ways it is.
Yeah.
And it's a trend that's only going to accelerate
Right.
as technology continues to evolve and access to information becomes even more widespread.
It's a fascinating
It is.
and, frankly,
Yeah,
a bit terrifying time to be alive.
I agree.
Yeah,
We're witnessing a fundamental shift in power dynamics,
we are.
and the old rules no longer apply.
And what we're seeing in Kenya, this clash between Gen Z and President Ruto,
Yes.
is just one chapter in this much larger story.
It is.
It's a story that's being written in real time
Yes.
with global implications.
Absolutely.
And it's a story that demands our attention
It does.
because it's not just about what's happening in Kenya.
Right.
It's about the kind of world we want to live in.
It's about justice, accountability, and the right of every individual to have their voice heard
Right.
and their rights respected.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected
Absolutely.
and that what happens in one corner of the world affects us all.
It does.
It's about understanding that silence is complicity
Yes.
and that we each have a responsibility to speak out against injustice
We do.
and demand better from our leaders. It's about remembering that hope,
Yes.
even in the darkest of times,
Right.
can be a powerful force for change.
It can.
So let's not turn away from these difficult conversations.
No.
Let's engage with them,
Yes.
learn from them, and find ways to use our voices and our actions to make a positive difference in the world.
I agree.
Because in the end,
Yeah.
the story of humanity is a story that we're all writing together.
It is well said, Sheraton.
Thank you.
You've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
Well, it's been a heavy conversation.
It has.
It's been a heavy conversation, but you're right.
It has.
We can't shy away from these issues.
Absolutely not.
And speaking of heavy,
Yes.
I keep thinking about the immense pressure on Kenya's Gen Z.
I know.
Imagine leading a movement
Yeah.
against a president accused of such serious corruption.
I know. It's quite a burden.
They're up against a system
Right.
that seems stacked against them,
It does.
and yet they persist.
They do.
It's inspiring,
It.
but it's also got to be incredibly daunting.
Yes.
What can our listener, sitting here maybe thousands of miles away,
Right.
actually do to help?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Does sending a tweet really make a difference?
Well, it might sound like a small act,
Okay.
but awareness is the first step towards change.
Right.
When we share information about these injustices, when we amplify the voices of those who are being silenced,
Yeah.
we contribute to a global movement for accountability.
So retweeting those protest hashtags,
Yes.
sharing news articles from reputable sources like
Yeah.
The Standard or The Nation,
Exactly.
even just
It-
talking about this case with friends and family,
Absolutely.
all of that matters.
It all makes a difference.
Wow.
And you can go a step further.
Okay.
You can support organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch,
Yeah.
who are working on the ground in Kenya
Right.
to document human rights abuses
Okay.
and provide legal aid to victims. Even a small donation can make a real difference.
And for those who really want to get involved,
Yes.
contacting their elected officials to express their concern about the situation in Kenya
Absolutely.
could also have an impact.
Governments respond to pressure, especially from their own citizens.
That's true.
Let your representatives know that you're paying attention to what's happening in Kenya
All right.
and that you expect them to prioritize human rights in their foreign policy decisions.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges.
It's easy to feel that way,
Yeah.
but every action, no matter how small, contributes to a larger wave of change.
And remember, this isn't just about Kenya.
No, it's not.
It's about upholding democratic principles
Yeah.
and human rights everywhere.
It is. The fight for justice is a global one,
It is.
and we all have a role to play.
Well said, Sheraton.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to circle back to something we've touched on throughout this deep dive.
Yeah.
The role of social media. It's clearly been a game changer for Gen Z in Kenya,
It has.
allowing them to organize, mobilize, and get their message out to a global audience.
Absolutely.
But as we all know,
Yes.
social media is a double-edged sword.
You're absolutely right.
It's a powerful tool for communication and connection,
It is.
but it can also be used to spread misinformation, sow division, and even incite violence.
We've seen it happen.
We see that happening all over the world, not just in Kenya.
Unfortunately,
It's become increasingly difficult to discern fact from fiction,
it has.
truth from propaganda.
Right, and that's why it's more important than ever to be critical consumers of information.
It is.
We need to be mindful of our sources,
Right.
double-check facts,
Yeah.
and be wary of sensationalized headlines or emotionally charged content.
We can't just passively consume information.
No.
We have to actively engage with it.
Absolutely.
Ask questions,
Yeah.
challenge assumptions,
Mhm.
and seek out diverse perspectives.
And be especially cautious about information shared on social media.
Okay.
It's often designed to provoke an emotional response.
Oh, I see.
rather than to inform.
It's like navigating a minefield out there.
It can feel that way.
Yeah.
But it's a challenge we have to face head on.
Right.
The future of democracy in Kenya and beyond
Yeah.
may depend on our ability to navigate the digital landscape responsibly and to use social media as a tool for positive change.
It's call to action for all of us.
It is.
We have to be more than just consumers of information.
Yeah,
We have to be active participants in shaping the digital landscape
absolutely.
and holding those in power accountable.
I agree.
So as we leave our listener with this case,
Okay.
what's the one thing you hope they take away from this deep dive, Sheraton?
Well, I hope they realize that even though this case is unfolding in Kenya,
Right.
the themes we've discussed,
Yeah.
corruption, human rights abuses,
Yeah.
the power of social media are relevant everywhere.
They are.
It's a reminder that we're all interconnected,
We are.
and the fight for justice is a global one.
The situation in Kenya might feel far removed from our listeners' daily lives.
It might.
But the principles at stake,
Yeah.
transparency,
Yes.
accountability, the right to dissent,
Exactly.
these are universal.
They are. They apply to all of us.
So stay informed, stay engaged,
Yeah.
and never underestimate the power of your voice to make a difference.
I agree.
And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to delve deeper into the case of Gen Z versus President Ruto.
Absolutely.
There's a wealth of information out there,
There is.
from reputable news sources to the reports of human rights organizations.
A lot of good information available.
It's a complex and evolving situation,
It is.
but one that deserves our attention and our action.
I agree.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground today,
We have.
and I want to thank you, Sheraton, for guiding us through this intricate
Oh, it's my pleasure.
and, frankly, at times, disturbing case.
It is a disturbing case.
And to our listeners,
Yes.
thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Gen Z versus President Ruto.
We appreciate you listening.
We'll be back soon with another compelling case
We will.
that's sure to keep you on the edge of your seat.
Absolutely.
Until then, stay curious, stay informed,
Stay engaged.
and as always,
Yeah,
remember, the truth is out there.
it is.
I'm James Braden,
And I'm Sheraton Mullick.
signing off.